Welcome to today's introductory webinar on the concerns-based adoption model. My name is Ed Tobia, and I will be joined today by two additional staff members from CETL's Center for High Performing Schools, Jason LaTurner and Brian Litke. Also joining us will be Dr. Vicki Butler, Federal Programs Director for the Cullman County Schools in Alabama, a school system that is actually using some of the CBAM processes throughout the course of this year. During today's webinar, we will describe the components of the concerns-based adoption model and how schools and districts can use the tools and processes of CBAM to monitor and manage implementation of any new program or initiative. Our objectives during this hour are to describe the purpose and use of the three diagnostic dimensions of CBAM: innovation configuration maps, stages of concern, and levels of use, and to identify the changes in practice that can be measured by CBAM. To set the stage, I'd like to pose some questions that will help us consider what happens when schools, districts, or any organization begin implementing a new program or process. For example, how might you capture information about people's feelings about a new program? And does it matter? I mean, some people may be eager early adopters, but others may be hesitant to try something new, and still others may actually actively resist change. Individual feelings about change can certainly impact implementation. The second issue regarding implementation is whether everyone has the same idea about what they need to do. So how might you determine their level of understanding? Even when everyone has attended the same orientation or training, they may come away with very different ideas about what it looks like in practice. Having a clear picture of the behavioral expectations a new process entails means more individuals will be likely to implement the process with fidelity. A third key question that you may ask yourself during implementation is, how well are individuals applying the new process? We all know that when a new practice is introduced, it takes some time for that practice to become implemented fully. Some staff may get caught up with the day-to-day management of the program and apply it very mechanically, while others seem to catch on right away. CBAM can help to address all of these implementation issues. What have you done in the past to determine the level of implementation of a new program or practice? What we're going to do at this point is to pull up a poll for you to look at. And it's a question, again, let me repeat the question, and that is, what have you done in the past to determine the level of implementation of a new program or practice? You'll see that there are some buttons where you can make a vote there. So if you would take a moment to respond, and we'll talk about the results when the poll closes. I think we have enough information at this point, so I'm going to close the poll, and it looks like quite a number of people at this point are systematically monitoring implementation using some process. Actually, CBAM is one of those processes that you can use, but it's also does occur quite often that when we're implementing something, we'll ask people, well, how's it going? And kind of get a general idea of what it looks like from there. But it's important for us to really move beyond that just general idea and get a very specific idea about implementation and get a handle on that. So let's go to the next slide, which we're going to be talking about implementation at this point, because that's really what CBAM keys into. When you're in charge of supporting an innovation, you'll want to know if it has had the intended impact. But first you need to take a look at implementation. You'll want to know if a new program or process has been worth the time, effort, and funds it's taken to put it into practice, and whether or not that program is worth continuing. But when you start thinking about that, the question that comes to mind is, how do you know that a new approach has had an impact on student learning? But wait, before you can really answer either of those two questions, you need to think about the bigger questions listed here that relate to implementation. Do all of the teachers have the same understanding about the program expectations? To what extent are they using the new approach? How are teachers' feelings influencing implementation? The concerns-based adoption model can help you to answer these implementation questions. The CBAM process consists of 3 diagnostic dimensions that can provide a school or a district or an organization with data that drive decisions. Let's take a closer look at these 3 elements. Pictured here are the 3 diagnostic dimensions of CBAM. The innovation configuration map describes what an innovation looks like in practice. The stages of concern gives us a sense of the attitudes and beliefs individuals have about a new practice. And levels of use provides information that describes the actions or behaviors of individuals related to the new practice or program. Together, these 3 diagnostic dimensions provide specific information about implementation that help us decide what may be needed in terms of adjusting the timeline, or maybe what professional development might be needed, or what improvements the system may need. Let's begin by our exploration of CBAM by defining innovation configuration maps. Gene Hall and Shirley Hord, 2 of the original developers of the concerns-based adoption model, describe an IC map as a word picture that describes the actions or behaviors individuals engage in as they are implementing a new program or practice. We've used this illustration often when introducing the concept of an IC map. As Hall and Hord pointed out, some individuals may have surprisingly different views of what an innovation looks like when it's implemented. The original idea here was to put up a tire swing in the backyard, but then other planners got involved. However, there are some essential components of any new approach. For this backyard swing, one key component is a rope. In this illustration, there are 3 variations of a rope for the swing. 1 rope, 2 ropes, or 3 ropes. Another key component is the support for the rope. Again, there are 3 variations. 1 branch, 2 branches, or the tree trunk. The third major component of any swing is some kind of seat, And we can see that there is a tire, one plank, or 3 planks. That illustration helps to define the idea of components and variations we will use when you develop an innovation configuration map. Again, components are those major operational features, and variations are the different ways that they can be operationalized. From this illustration, we can see that there are 3 components: a rope, a support, and a seat. And each one of those has variations. The variations of the rope are 1 rope, 2 ropes, or 3 ropes. The variations for the support are 1 branch, 2 branches, or a trunk. And for the seat, the variations are a tire, a plank, or 3 planks. There's really only one set of variations that best describe the objective, the original objective for the backyard swing. And that is 1 rope on 1 branch with a tire as the seat. Now, let's take a look at an example from education. When you begin developing an IC map, you begin with thinking about the essential components of an approach. For example, here are 2 of the components of differentiated instruction. These ideas are very vague and general, but we need to get more specific. First step in getting more specific is to use active verbs to describe what an individual would do. In this case, a teacher provides high-quality core curriculum. But 2 teachers may have very different ideas of what a high-quality curriculum means. We need to get more specific still. In this illustration, we're beginning to develop more detail about what it means for a teacher to provide a high-quality core curriculum, as well as what some teachers may do that doesn't meet expectations. On the left is a clear set of behaviors that describe what a teacher does to provide high-quality core curriculum. On the right is a behavior that is undesirable if a teacher is working to implement differentiated instruction. Here's an example of a completed set of variations. Don't worry if you can't read all of this. We're going to go through this kind of quickly. If you really want more information, we'll be having more detail in a 5-part webinar series coming up later on, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But as you can see here, the continuum goes from the least desirable to the most desirable behaviors. There are 4 uses or typical uses for an IC map. The first one is for research purposes, and it really helps to create consistency among users in a control group. When people are in a control group, you know that each one is applying it in this very way. It provides some very specific idea about what it looks like in practice. It's also useful for evaluation purposes by providing data, and it gives you an idea of the extent that an innovation has been implemented. A very common use for it is dissemination, or actually communication as well, because here you're developing a common vision for what a new practice looks like and doesn't look like in action. It can also provide a great deal of information about what professional development might be needed. When you identify 5 components, for example, you may find that one of those components is typically not really at the ideal level. So that would give you information about, Well, that's an area where we really need to be providing some more professional development. At this point, Jason Letourneau is going to give you some background information about stages of concern. Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm actually in Cullman County, Alabama, as we speak, and I'll be interviewing Vicki a little bit later. But we happen to be here this week, the same week we are doing this webinar, and the work we've been doing here has, as Ed mentioned earlier, has been around the CBAM process. So I'm going to focus specifically for just a few minutes on the stage of concern dimension of CBAM. Where here the key question, as you can see, is after we've defined what the innovation is using the IC Innovation Configuration Map process, we then really want to start looking at how individuals, what their feelings and attitudes are relative to the implementation of that initiative. So essentially it allows us to start focusing on the individual and how what their concerns are with the innovation. So as you can see again from the model, we're going to focus on the yellow part. I'm going to be focusing on that. Again, focusing on the stages of concern, how an individual reacts to the innovation, and again, what we're really focused on are the individual attitudes and their beliefs. So I want to emphasize that concerns really refers to their feelings or reactions and attitudes. It's not so much, oh, what am I worried about? What are my anxieties or my fears? But really how someone is interacting with the innovation, how they're reacting to it, and what their attitudes are about it. And the way we collect this information, one of the ways is through a 35-item questionnaire. So this is a questionnaire that was developed by Hall and Horde and a couple others back in the late 1970s, or during the 1970s. It's been tested and retested, and you know, the statistician or the geek in me likes to point out that over 500 questions were initially a part of the original tests when they began. And through a series of factor analysis, they found that 35 questions loaded on seven different dimensions. So I like to, talk that way once in a while. But more plainly, basically there are 7 different areas or 7 different stages of concern, and each of those areas have 5 questions that contribute to a person's score. So after an individual takes the 35-question survey, it is scored, and Brian will show you in a minute how that's done electronically. And then a profile is developed, basically showing the relative intensity of each of their concerns, each of the different seven stages. It has been regularly revalidated, and most recently was sort of revamped in 2006. And again, with a little bit of tweaking, basically the questionnaire has stayed the same. One little quick caveat, and we'll talk again about the profiles in a moment, but that is that when we talk about a person's score, it's not mutually exclusive. Someone can have a high concern in more than one area. Again, we'll show you that with some demonstration, but one thing to consider is that it is possible to be concerned about more than one thing, as we know, in our regular lives, but it's also true here in the stages of concern questionnaire. So I wanted to give you just a very brief overview of the 7 different stages. Again, as Ed mentioned, we will be having a multi-part webinar, online webinar 5-part series coming up where we will go into much more detail exactly what each stage means and how you'd look at assessing the different stages of concern for an individual or group. Another thing to recognize too is that when we talk about stages of concern, you may actually look at an individual, or you may look at the stages of concern for a school or a grade level or class. So there's different ways to have the group that you're looking at. It might be an individual or it might be a group. So really quickly, when I think about each stage, I like to think about a typical statement that we would hear from someone. So for example, the first stage is what we call unconcerned. Essentially, it's that the person doesn't have any concerns about the innovation because they're not really thinking about it yet. So a typical statement for that individual might be, I have other things to do that are more important to me. The next stage is where an individual has informational concerns. So in this case, it may be that the individual would like to learn more about the innovation. Stage 2 are personal concerns, which essentially is when an individual is concerned how the innovation will affect them. How will it affect their work? So again, that's very different than informational. Essentially, how would it affect their established routines? So that's what we see when we have someone with high personal concerns. And both of these, stage 1 and stage 2, are what we call self-concerns. They're really thinking about themselves, how they maybe need more information, or how, again, the innovation, whatever the new program is, will affect them personally. The next stage that we consider is our management concerns. In this case, an individual may be starting to get involved with the program, but they may say something like, I feel like I'm spending all my time getting material ready. So they have these issues about how it is that they're actually supposed to implement the new program or the innovation. So those would be considered management concerns. We call those tasks. So making sure that the task for the program or innovation can happen. The next group of concerns, the first is consequence. And so in this case, an individual might say, I'm wondering how this innovation will affect my students. So someone at this stage of concern is really thinking more about how the innovation will affect their students. Stage 5 are what we call collaboration concerns, and this would be an individual who might say, I'd like to work with others on this who are using the innovation. I'd like to figure out how to work with others. And so that would be something, again, as the title says, where they're focusing on collaboration with others. The last item is refocusing. So what's interesting about that is an individual in this case may have some ideas about how the innovation could be better. I'll talk about that a little more in just a second. But so again, the last one would be where the individual is seeking to possibly improve the innovation. And we call all of those impact, whether it's impact on the student or impact on how they might work with others, or ultimately impact on the program and working to see if they can improve the program. So again, as I mentioned, those are a very brief overview of the 7 stages of concern. Before I talk a little bit more about how we would look at the data and how we look at different profiles for the stages of concern, we wanted to have Brian actually talk to you about how easy or how straightforward it is to do this. In the old days, again, well, that's the 70s, 80s, or even the 90s, all this information was done by pen and paper. So you would give the stages of concern questionnaire to individuals. You'd gather that data together, you'd do various scoring methods, and you'd come up with scoring profiles. You'd score the profiles on your own. Now, and actually Brian has not only built it, but he administers the system. It's all done electronically through some tools that Brian built. So Brian's going to talk about that briefly, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit more about the profiles. Brian?
Thank you, Jason. My name is Brian Lidke, and I'd like to take a few moments to tell you about the SoCQ Online. As Jason said, the SoCQ Online is an online tool that CETL has constructed to help you administer the Stages of Concern questionnaire. And I'll focus on why you might consider using it versus a paper version of the SoCQ, and I'll tell you how to get a demo account so you can try the SoCQ Online for yourself. The primary benefit of the SoCQ Online is that it saves you time. So since it's online, you can send an email with a link to your survey, and the participants can fill it out immediately no matter where they're located. Everything is automated, and that really allows you more time to look at the data and interpret it. The data that comes in is scored, and some graphs and reports are available immediately. There's no math to do, and there's no errors to check for, and that's so much easier than scoring a paper version of the survey where you might really add things up twice to make sure you didn't make a mistake. There's multiple slices of data that can be viewed based on how you set up the questionnaire options, and the data can be exported to Microsoft Excel or other statistical software such as SPSS. The SoCQ Online auto-generates graphs of the user's concerns. The graph on this slide is a single-line graph that you might see when you're viewing the report for the full group of participants. So you can examine the highest stage of concern for all of the participants together as a group. For the graph that we see on screen, we can see the continuum of concerns across the bottom, and a red line indicates the highest stage of concern, that is the personal concern for this group. Using the SoCQ Online, you can also see single-line graphs for each individual participant, so you can see individuals' concerns. Now I'd like to talk about viewing slices of the data. If you customize your SoCQ Online by adding a subgroup question, such as, what subject do you teach, language arts or math? You can use the results from the participants to filter the data and view a concerns graph for the subgroup. The graph that we see on this slide shows the concerns profile of language arts teachers as compared to math teachers. And you can see in this case, the concerns are very different between the two groups. So you might consider adding multiple subgroup questions to allow you to see how the concerns are different in different groups in your school. For instance, you could ask a question that asks the number of years of teaching experience, and you could later see the groups of concerns for inexperienced teachers versus more experienced teachers. So when you're thinking about what subgroup questions to add, you might think about your context and what subgroups you would like to examine to see if you find any interesting results. Lastly, I'd like to talk about customizing the SoCQ Online. You can enter the name of the innovation that you're examining, and the system will integrate the innovation name into the standard 35 questions that are automatically part of the Stages of Concern questionnaire. But you can also add additional subgroup questions, and these subgroup questions let you later see slices of the data. So the more questions you add, the more slices you'll be able to view. You can also add open text questions to collect additional data that's appropriate for an open text response, where the user can describe something in detail. To get your participants to the survey, the system will generate a customized link for you that you can include in an email to send to your participants. And finally, you can view the reports and look at your data in many ways. At this point, you might be wondering, how do I get access to the SoCQ Online? We'll be sending information to you in a follow-up email after this webinar, and that'll come later today. So right now, I'd like to just wrap up the discussion of the SoCQ Online by saying it helps you rapidly deploy the survey, and it really does everything for you except for interpreting the SoCQ results. So now I'd like to turn the presentation back to Jason, who will be talking about the interpretation of the SoCQ results. Jason?
Thanks, Brian. Again, we wanted to just pause for a moment so you could see that developing the profiles using the online system is fairly quick. It's not labor intensive before we actually talked about some of the details. So this, again, what we're seeing here, and it's something you saw a moment ago, is what an actual profile would look like after you've administered the SoCQ Online. Again, in this case, you can see at the top it's school-wide results. But it could be for a grade level, or it could even be an individual. So again, depending on the grouping level, the graph would show the data for that specific group, however it is that you've grouped it. One thing that's important to remember is what we're looking at here is relative intensity. So essentially, what is most important? So for example, in this group, you see, as Brian mentioned, that personal concerns are the most important. You also see that unconcerned and information is also relatively high. So we would probably think that this sort of school-wide, the results from school-wide are probably from an innovation that's relatively new. As you can see that, again, there you go. Thank you, Brian. That the personal concern is the highest. And another indicator that we have is that consequence is the lowest. So it might be that you want to look at both what's the highest, that is personal, and what's the lowest, consequence. So given this, as I would interpret it, it probably is a group that's fairly new to some innovation, some process. And so they're still trying to figure it out. They're still trying to figure out how it works for them, what other sorts of information they need, and they haven't really yet started thinking about how it will impact their students. So one key with SoCQ or the SoC is what would we then do with these data? So that's what's really important, is how would it give us information so we would know what sort of follow-up action to take. In this case, because the personal is high and the consequence is low, we'd probably want to really address individual their own personal concerns, talk to them about how this innovation may or may not affect their work, and so there may just sort of be some background introduction to the innovation that's still necessary. Again, they're not yet really thinking about how it will work with their students, so that's not the kind of professional development necessarily that you need in this case. Looking at another example, we like to call this, well, the big W, because it's in the shape of a W, sort of. But this is something that looks very different. So you can see, for example, that the highest concern here is management. So again, if you remember some of the typical statements, this person is very concerned about making this work. They're not quite sure how it would fit into their schedule. They're having a difficult time actually doing the work of whatever the innovation is. And we're also a little bit concerned because the refocusing score on the right-hand side is relatively high. So not only are they having a hard time actually making it happen and implementing it, they're also thinking about ways that they might want to change it. So just as a note, something that we think about when we see this sort of profile, and again, it's on differentiated instruction, so you may have some individuals who perhaps are just trying to figure out how to make differentiated instruction fit inside their day, but they're also considering about how they might change it. So one thing that's interesting about a high refocusing score is that it may be that an individual thinks the program is, let's say, good, and they want to make some improvements. But it also could mean, I'm really tired of this program, I'm not making it work, and I kind of want to throw it out. So those are the kind of things where you'd want to look at not only the refocusing score, but also the management score. And so look at the entire profile. The next thing to realize, well, let me show you one more slide, and that is essentially this idea of a wave motion. So it's okay, for example, that someone who's new to a program has a lot of the self-concerns. This might be what, again, on average, that sort of profile would look like. We would expect that to be the case with a new innovation. We'd expect the fact that it'd be mostly informational. They're trying to figure it out. They may not know too much about it, so they may be unconcerned. And so that is pretty normal for something that's new. But what we then want to see eventually is that the individuals would start to think about how to actually implement it. So you could see possibly their concerns turn more towards management and also turn more towards how it might affect their students. And so ideally, over the life of an innovation, we would see a change from self to task. And ultimately, in a sort of ideal situation, we would see the third phase where they will really be focusing on impact. What consequence do they have for their students? How can they collaborate with others? And in this case, we would hope the refocusing would mean, hey, I have some ideas on how I can improve it. And so that's sort of this SoC Wave Motion. And so that's essentially how we would typically approach the idea. Again, concerns aren't bad. It's good to have concerns. It's good to sort of have these different relative intensities for each of these items. But then what's really key is what you do with that information. So what we'd recommend first, and again, this is something we'll talk more about in the longer webinar series, but the first thing would be really to verify the information that you see in the surveys using some interviews or some open-ended statements. People like to kid me, I love statistics. When I was doing research on teachers, they'd always ask me, how many teachers did you talk to today? I'd be, well, I didn't actually talk to any, but I have this great, big, huge data set that I'm using. And so certainly I've come to appreciate the importance of qualitative data as well. And really that's sort of the two sides of the SoC here. The one is very quantitative oriented, and it's giving you some real good hard data, but then we really recommend following that up with some interviews where you would actually talk to individuals, or an open-ended statement, which would be something like at the end of a staff meeting, you may ask, we're doing this new program, differentiated instruction. What are your concerns about it? And then you would just essentially, it would help you better understand what it is that you were seeing in the quantitative data, in the survey data. But all that to be said, that, again, I love data. I'm excited when I have the profiles and I have the additional data from the interviews, but what's really important about the process is what you then do with the data once you have it. And so taken together, what we want to do is take these data to inform our appropriate interventions, or essentially what are the next steps for us. So in this case, if an individual had high personal concerns, you may want to alleviate those concerns. That wouldn't necessarily be through professional development. It might just be through informal conversations. An individual that had the big W, for example, high management concerns, you may really need to do some professional development on how it is that you can implement this innovation in a more efficient way. And so again, really it's about figuring out what your next steps as a leader, as a principal, or as a central office, using those data to inform your practice as a district or a school so that you can implement the innovation better. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ed now.
All right, thank you, Jason. Well, we've already taken a look at the innovation configuration map and stages of concern. And now we'll take a brief overview of the levels of use, which is the third diagnostic dimension of the concerns-based adoption model. The levels of use focuses attention on the behaviors of individuals and provides information on whether an individual is a non-user, a beginning user, a practice user, or perhaps even a reflective user, someone who's really thinking very deeply about the use and the implications of this new process, or the process, it may not be new anymore, but a process that they've been using for a while. The levels of use data provides a picture of implementation that can inform decisions about the support or professional development that may be needed to improve implementation. It can also help to focus on the effectiveness of a new process or procedure. It also is very useful in research studies because it avoids that dichotomy of use and non-use, because there are actually 3 levels of non-use and 5 use levels. You might want to say, well, someone's using it or not using it, but levels of use really gives you a sense of where they are in this continuum. And let's take a look at the continuum of the levels of use. It starts off with level 0. And like Jason, I'm going to use the typical statements that go along with that. So here's someone who might say, you know, I've heard about it, but right now I'm just not interested in learning anything more about it. They're not involved with the particular program or process that might be being introduced here. The level is the level of orientation. Here, someone is acquiring information about it. So a typical statement might be something like, I've set aside time every week for studying the materials and learning about this new process. So they're beginning to gather some material about it and begin to learn about it. The next level is really preparation. It's more of a getting ready to begin. It's more than just learning about it, but here's someone who's actually getting ready to begin. A typical statement might be, I'm pulling the materials together and getting my lesson plans organized, and I'm going to begin to implement this new idea as soon as school begins. All 3 of those really are non-users. We consider someone who's at the preparation stage someone who hasn't yet begun to use the new process. They're preparing. They're really thinking about it. They're preparing their materials, but they're not using it just yet. The next level is mechanical use. And this is where someone is really focusing in on, you know, I've got some ideas about how to pull this off, but I seem to be planning every night for what I'm going to be doing the next day. After that comes routine use. And in routine use, one of the things that we find people saying is, this year has been worked out pretty well for me, and I'm sure there's going to be a few changes next year, but basically I'm going to be using it the same way. They're really not making any changes. They've got it down, but they're not considering making any changes or improving the process that they've been engaged with. And that's a little bit different than the next one, which is level 4B. And in this level, the user might be saying, I've really recently pulled together a more detailed assessment instrument to get specific information from my students to see where I need to change my use of the innovation. So at the refinement area, one of the things that someone is doing is they've gone beyond routine, and they're now coming up with ways of refining the processes that they've been using, refining that new program or new process that they've engaged in. The next level is integration. And here, one of the things that teachers begin to do is to connect with other teachers. And it might be a social studies teacher who's using a new program who says, I'm finding that I really need to be talking with the other content area teachers because there's so much other content that's tied here. So a typical statement might be something like, we come together and we talk about the use and the impact of this innovation during our weekly PLC meetings. So this is where someone is really beginning to talk about it more often, engage with other teachers, and really have some conversations about not just working on their own to refine it, but really beginning to work with other teachers as well. Then there's the renewal level. At the renewal level, someone is really reevaluating the overall use of the innovation. They may look at making some major modifications. A typical statement would be, I'm reading, talking, and even doing a little research to see whether some other innovation might be better for my students. So that gives you an idea about the different levels of what a user would be. There are ways of actually getting at that information. And the first is an informal process. Most often, most people are using this informal process, and I'll give you an idea about what that is in a moment, but there's also a very formal interview protocol that's used in order to capture levels of use data. The informal gives you a quick estimate of an individual's overall level of use. And it also helps to guide some of those actions to facilitate their further use of that innovation. This is where, as Jason was suggesting earlier, it really provides you with some information about the interventions that might be helpful to engage people in. So what actions would you need to take to help people move perhaps from the mechanical use level into the routine level? Or what actions might you take to help them move from routine into refinement? Now, there is also a formal procedure which is much more rigorous and detailed. This actually is used for research, assessment, and evaluation studies. So for people who are using the levels of use protocol for a research study, such as a dissertation, it does require a 3-day face-to-face training and certification. So I think that it's helpful to consider where you are and the kinds of data you want to be capturing here. Most people are going to use levels of use to get that quick estimate of an individual's level of use. You can pull together that information across an entire group of people and begin to get some ideas about what actions need to be taken next. One of the things that we'll do at this point, we would like to hear from Vicki Butler, who is currently the Director of Federal Programs in Cullman County, Alabama. And Cullman County has been using CBAM for this whole year this year, and she's going to give us some information about what they've been doing there. Vicki?
Hi, we're back on the line. First, actually, we hadn't really planned on questions, but I see the question about interventions being a little bit of a negative word. What's interesting is literally this morning, again, we're over here in Cullman working, we had a conversation on the word interventions and instead have been using action to support change. So it's a great question, and it is something that we've been thinking about as a sort of a CBAM team, so I appreciate that. And you've just confirmed that interventions can have a little bit of a negative connotation, so thanks so much for that question. That said, I've really enjoyed being here in Cullman. They do have excellent barbecue here in northern Alabama, but what's better are the folks that we've been working with. And so I was just going to actually sort of lead a quick question and answer with Vicki, who is sitting right here with me, about the CBAM process and how she used it. And if you have questions for me later about barbecue and things like that, we can do that offline. But first, Vicki, I just wanted to know, in general, and thanks, Vicki, for being here, but essentially, in general, how is it that you how did you know you wanted to get training in CBAM for the district and the school?
Well, my role as Federal Programs Director is to make sure that the money is spent correctly and that we're investing our money instead of spending our money. And we have, in my department is school improvement, and then we work very closely with curriculum. And what we discovered was that we were not really carefully considering what we were going to purchase and how we were going to invest our money in professional development. So we needed some sort of a framework so we were all on the same page, and we wanted it to be research-based. And I had actually heard Ed speak before, and one of our special ed coordinator had gone through the online training for CBAM and came back and said, this is something we really need to look at. So that was the initial conversation. We wanted to know if we were spending our money correctly or investing it rather than spending it, and we wanted to know that we were getting enough bang for our buck and that we were effectively evaluating what we were doing.
I think it's interesting. I know you've said it in groups before. Essentially, you had a lot of stuff going on, and you wanted to figure out, how do we know if we're doing any good with this or not? Yeah,
we would have have about 9,500 students, 28 schools, and a large geographical area, and a relatively small central office staff. And what we realized, we were all working very hard at the same thing, but we were all working in basically like you would in a high school classroom in a lot of ways with the door closed. So we needed to get together and develop a framework and a common vocabulary. So if one of us was tackling a specific problem or we're looking at a program, that we all would come together and talk about that in the same way, and we needed a methodical way for discussion and for evaluation.
Okay, with that in mind, tell us a little bit more. Again, we have some bullets just to not so much cue Vicki, but just so that you had some sort of high-level bullets of some of the ideas that we came up as we chatted with Vicki. But how has the introduction of CBAM or the use of CBAM helped, and what are some challenges that you've encountered?
Well, it's really deepened our learning at the central office, and it's deepened our learning in our communication with us and the schools, because we look at it as a we. We don't look at it as us and them, and we're really working on that. Part of the challenge was that I messed up. I rolled it out wrong. I had some assumptions that were incorrect, and it really, by getting up into the group, by getting up in front of the group of people and saying, you know what, you're right, we didn't do this quite right, we're sorry, let's back up and do it again, that developed trust because we were not the holy knowers. We didn't know everything we were supposed to do, and we became learners along with our principals and beside each other rather than just disseminating information. So the challenge was to own up to our mistakes.
Right. Again, I think one strength also, which is one of the bullets, but that it, not so much the CBAM process, but what resulted from that with ICs and so on, with innovation configuration maps, is this the vocabulary that you could share.
Right.
And so I think that was, we've been talking a lot the last couple of days about communication and listening, and the whole process is really a promoter of that, I think.
Well, you go back to Ed's swing, and what I thought and what the other people in the other departments thought and what the principals thought, we might all think we're saying the same thing, but when we really got down to the bottom of it, we had different ideas. So this has helped us. The ICs that we've developed and continue to develop give us a common vision and a common definition. It's been very, very helpful. And, of course, we're still on a learning curve. This webinar has helped bring things together even for me.
So, again, we touched on these a little bit already. What are some of the changes you've seen as a result of working on the CBAM process with us at CETL?
We take the time to fully investigate what we're going to do before in a more in-depth way than we ever have. And right now we're looking at technology. We are looking at our programs and processes on the front end with exactly what we want our outcomes to be. And that might seem very elementary to some people, but if you've ever lived in the world of a central office or in the world of a school when time is of the essence, sometimes those decisions, we've said, no, we're going to slow down and look at this from the beginning and what our outcomes are going to be and build our program based on need and based on what we want our expectations on. And then also the evidence that we have been able to dig through, we use the SoCQ. That gave us some overall, we thought we were doing great in one area, and we administered the questionnaire. It was like, whoa, that is not exactly what we thought.
Well, like we were training, like how we're
back in and do the
I was really thinking like
and do the levels of use interviews, and so that's given us our next steps. We're using that evidence-based to guide our next steps.
I think that's been the most powerful thing that we witnessed is just transformation is a little bit melodramatic, I suppose, but this real change in how you think about data, not just with the CBAM process, has promoted this use of data in even more, so make decisions. So thank you, Vicki. Ed, I'll turn it back to you now.
Understanding that it's difficult to have.
It sounds like someone is talking in the background as well, and it's kind of coming through the line. So I think, well, it's stopped at this point. What we would like to do right now is to give you an idea of what some of the next steps could be. One of the things that we would suggest is that you can go to the website, which is cetl.org/CBAM, where you can get information about some of the videos and some access to print materials about the concerns-based adoption model. One of the things that's going to be occurring after today's webinar is that you'll be receiving a follow-up email that's going to have links to a number of resources that you can access. One of those links will give you some information, as Brian said, where you can request a demonstration account for the online version of the Stages of Concern questionnaire. You'll have a place where you can go to request customized professional development, which may consist of some one-on-one assistance or some on-site training or technical assistance. The on-site training is what we have been doing as an organization in Cullman County for this entire year. And it's really had quite an impact there, as you've heard from Vicki. Additionally, we're going to be sending you some information about how to sign up for a 5-part webinar series that's going to begin in June. That 5-part webinar series will go into much more detail, and you would be able to really come away from that with some specific skills on developing an innovation configuration, some specific skills with interpreting stages of concern results, and some practice with actually collecting levels of use data. There'll be assignments in between each one of the 5 webinars where you'll be sending assignments into us, and you'll be able to receive some feedback on the work that you've been doing there. Also in the follow-up email, there's going to be a link to an online survey so that you can provide us some feedback about this webinar. I'm going to leave this up for a moment because there is some contact information on the screen here. If you are interested in getting some customized professional development, you can contact me, Ed Tobia, or if you're interested in setting up an account with the online stages of concern questionnaire, you can contact Brian. These are our email addresses and our phone numbers. Well, you have our phone numbers and email addresses. If you have other specific questions for us, we'd be very happy to respond to any questions that you have. And I'd like to thank everyone again for your participation. And that ends our presentation for today. Thank you all very much.